The theme of our morning session so far was, of course, the butterfly effect, the various sources of changes that affect us all and connect us in unexpected ways. We're now moving to a second segment, which is called In Charge, which is looking at responses to these kinds of changes, looking at who has new influence because of enabling technologies, how that changes balance of power, balance of command, and all the rest. I believe that Esther Dyson is here. 3 years ago, when she held the last of her legendary PC Forum conferences, the theme was Users in Charge. And I think she was ahead of her time on that, as in many other things. The power shift towards the individual is being acknowledged across the board in society and businesses and communication and all the rest. And from bloggers to YouTube performers, we find the individual being more and more strengthened by the technologies of the internet. We're going to investigate that in the sessions we're going to have before lunchtime. Now, we are living our own gospel of adapting to change and being flexible and responding to unexpected connections, which is that we're going to begin this segment with a part that was originally scheduled to come after lunch. And for this, we're going to have the return of Eric Schmidt, CEO of Google and hardest working man in show business for doing back-to-back interviews, who will be interviewing Jeffrey Immelt of General Electric. The connective theme here is, in a way, a sort of most fundamental sort of power shift and putting questions of being in charge, because Mr. Immelt is going to talk a lot about the sustainable energy initiatives, new initiatives for power generation that GE has been leading the world in. Corporations' motto, of course, is imagination at work, and that's going to be one theme that he'll discuss to lead off this In Charge session. I admire the confidence of both Eric Schmidt and Jeffrey Immelt. This is a sign of their great mastery of the field, that they would be discussing these questions of energy in front of Vice President Gore, who is sitting here in the front row and perhaps the world's expert on this subject. So please welcome Vice President Gore and welcome Eric Schmidt and Jeffrey Immelt.
Well, thank you all again. And what I thought would be fun would be to try to understand, what is it that got you to the point where you were the first U.S. CEO to actually talk about the biggest issue of our time?
You know, what I would say, Eric, is that the time when we really got to thinking about environmental, green investing, oil was maybe $25 a barrel.
The good old days.
The good old days. And, we were doing strategic reviews in 2003 or 2004, and we looked across the company at what our people were spending time on, and it was fundamentally energy efficiency, emissions reduction. We had just gotten into the water business, so clean water, clean energy. We sent some teams around to really study the science of global warming. We spent probably a year talking to customers about where we stood from a public policy standpoint, what they wanted to see. We put it all together and launched it in 2004, and I would say we had not super high expectations for what the response would be. At that time, the products that we considered to be eco-imagination products were about $4 or $5 billion in revenue. That'll be $18 billion today. So in 4 years, it's going from $4 or $5 billion to $18 billion. That's
big numbers.
That's when you can look back and say, gosh, this was a good idea. But at the time, it was just, we thought we would try to tie together a series of technologies that span the company and drive it forward into public thinking.
But did it feel sort of lonely at that time? I mean,
sure.
You literally were on this campaign and nobody else was listening to you.
We were, as an old company, as an American company, we've been around a long time. We probably have more Superfund sites than any other company, just because if you're around a long time, that's what happens. Society changes its mind about the environment, and so, we had lots of, I would say, suspicious people around our incentives when we launched it. But we felt like the time was right to try to attempt to do something like this. But we always wrapped it in a business cloak. In other words, we never saw this as corporate social responsibility. We kind of viewed this as, if it was something we wanted to do, we wanted to have hard metrics. So we always measured R&D spend. We always measured technology. We always measured our own reduction of greenhouse gases. And so we always made it a very hard initiative.
It's interesting that the history of General Electric, by the way, it's General Electric, right? It's important to remember. Thomas Edison, all the original, people here none of us were around, I guess. There was a big fight between AC and DC power and so forth, and the technology of the time resolved itself with the creation of this extraordinary company. And what's great about your job is you get to build really big things. So what's the biggest thing that you build?
I would probably say today a wind turbine probably takes the prize when you look at one of the blades being several football fields, things like that. I mean, you're talking about some really big things, but I would say the marriage between the neatest technology and the neatest looking thing we do is probably a locomotive. It's great technology. It's fun to be around. It's a good customer base. It's a really great business. It's high margin, high return, high market share. These grunty businesses look better and better every day,
especially this week.
Exactly.
But let's go back to the wind turbine. So, the original wind turbines, everybody had concerns about the blades went too fast and they would affect birds and motors were burning out. And your company essentially solved, as best I could tell, all of those problems. So describe a modern turbine today. Why would, actually, what I really want us to buy one. So I buy one.
Yeah. We'll put you in the list.
Is there a waiting list?
We made 2011. We might be able to squeeze you in.
Why can't you get my wind turbine to me sooner?
Well, Eric, since I'm here, you get a selected place, maybe not the list.
See.
But look, I mean, wind turbines were hula hoops 5 years ago. The technology stunk. The economics were horrible. And if anybody, basically there was no way to justify quite their existence without strong government subsidies. And I think what's happened was a combination of, both entrepreneurs but also bigger players got in the game. And at the end of the day, reliability was a big part of the cost position. So driving the cost down was very important. Making them more reliable was very important. What I would say is that the production tax credit has really worked. In other words, the cost per kilowatt hour might have been 15 cents a kilowatt hour 10 years ago. Today is 6 or 7 or 8 cents a kilowatt hour. That makes wind very competitive with coal and other
What's interesting is you're now actually getting to the point where you can genuinely choose wind over terrible choices economically.
Today, economically, it's about a dead heat, and that's at 1.5 megawatt wind turbine.
Why can't you make more of them?
No, look, it's all about supply chain today. In other words, one of the things we've done, I think, we'll probably be the biggest wind turbine player in the world this year, and the thing that GE has really done is secured supply chain. So we make more, we sell more, but the demand is very global. We have a, $600 or $700 million order out of Romania. We've got 4,000 megawatts in Turkey. So you really have immense.
And they see it because they see the same economics.
They see the economics. Some see it environmentally. Probably the second biggest market next year will be China. So,
which is amazing.
Wind works. And I would say on the renewable plate, it's the most reliable, it's the most economic technology out there. My own hunch is that if you really wanted to address the challenges, the U.S. would set a goal to say that by 2020, maybe 20% of the energy generated in the country should be renewable. That's possible, and wind would be a huge player in that regard.
One more thing about these turbines. So how big really are they?
Well, the turbine itself, is kind of like this stage, the circumference. And then the blade is just unimaginable.
How do you get the blade there?
If you look at from a
pieces?
factory, occasionally you'll get on the highway, you'll see the largest flatbed trucks.
Okay.
And those will have blades on them. And so but the challenge has been to make it reliable. And our reliability has really been fantastic. And that's been one of the contributions that people like GE bring to the industry.
Well, it's interesting that obviously you have your turbine, and I'm looking forward to mine. I'm sure we have lots of space here. And you have to connect it into the grid.
Is your credit good? Everybody's asking that these days.
We have good credit. We have good credit. We have very good credit. Very good credit. Google
Seems to be a big concern. Yeah.
And And by the way, we want to put the wind turbine right next to the data center to avoid transmission loss.
There you
Separate
go.
issue.
There you go.
But one of the things that happened, and again, General Electric was very involved in building out the original grid, is we're seeing tremendous capacity issues with the grid. And in my understanding of the way the grid works, it's largely an old-style industrial model of distribution. It's sort of hierarchical power distribution. It's not very automated at the level that it could be if it were done today. And the most obvious thing of criticism of wind is that wind doesn't blow all the time. Well, an observation is if you buy enough of his wind turbines, the wind actually does blow all the time because it blows somewhere all the time. No one has ever been worried about the wind stopping across the entire United States, right? So how do we solve the grid problem?
Look, I think there's fundamentally two things that have to be done, and both of which, we're working with Google on. I think one is there's going to have to be more capacity. And if we really want to drive renewable energy to where it could be in this country, we're going to have more transmission and distribution. And the government needs to supersede in some way in order to make that happen. And then the second thing is there's got to be, what's quote unquote called smart grid, which allows it to operate more effectively both in the last mile, but also as you wheel power around the country. And that's fundamentally software. I would call it, kind of software and gadgets. We make the gadgets, smart meters, things like that. People like Google could make the software, which makes the system, and people say that the system might lose somewhere between 10 and 20% of its efficiency. So there is more capacity out there to make the grid work better, and that's key to renewable energy.
In fact, one of the things that we're announcing today is that General Electric and Google are going to be essentially advocating in Washington the development of a new smarter grid to sort of enable a lot of this. And we think many companies are going to participate in this because it makes such good sense. And what's interesting about this is that there are people who are building things like plug-in hybrids. And the characteristic of a plug-in hybrid is you have a hybrid and you have a larger battery. And of course, you plug it in during the day, or at night, when electricity is cheaper, and then you can, in theory, send that battery-based power back into the grid during the day. Well, that's actually a fairly significant signaling and control problem, and it needs a smart grid. Again, General Electric is pretty heavily involved in every stage of that, of all of the instrumentation,
all the way.
Control system all the way. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Now, it turns out we've been talking about wind because it's the biggest thing you have. But in fact, you all build a lot of other things that are interesting. What do you do with geothermal? What do you do in the solar area? What do you do in other renewables?
Again, our approach has been to be broad in the energy space. So we basically have funded all the technologies from wind to gas to coal to nuclear to solar. And so what I would say, Eric, is that we bet big in wind and solar. And then our expectation is that things like geothermal, we'll partner with others on geothermal as time goes on. But I've advocated both inside the company and outside the company not to pick one technology, but to invest broadly across a lot of the different technical spaces, because I just think you can never plot where the dynamics are going to go around the right technology.
So is wind the farthest one down the path?
Wind is the farthest, well, I would make 2 points. Wind is by far the farthest one down the path. The other thing I would say, and again, this is one that people would disagree with, is in the end, energy, the world you come from in information technology, I ran our healthcare business. These were best in breed businesses. In other words, the best technology always won in healthcare, information technology. That's not true in energy. Energy is a place where the second best technology, well implemented, frequently wins. In other words, if you can get the cost down fast, if you can get the reliability up fast, then the basic companies don't want to take risk. And so there's a real risk homogenization that takes place in the world that we think about. So that's where energy is going to end up being a little bit different, and where utilities or other people around the world, they're going to take wind and run with it because it's good enough. It's clean, it's relatively low cost, and there's only so many of these technologies that can become big enough and get down the cost curve fast enough to be meaningful.
Do you do you understand now that you've been doing this for at least 5 years, sort of your, in fact, I think in many ways your career at General Electric will be defined by your sort of turning this giant to solve, again, this extraordinarily important problem. Do you have an opinion as to why it's been so difficult for everyone else to get on the bandwagon? Is it, is it a failure of political leadership? Is it the fact that people are so used to what they're currently doing? Is it money? Why has this been
Look, I think if you
so hard?
drew a map of all the R&D that's been spent since World War II, if you just took a chart of all the R&D in the United States since World War II, you've got massive in Department of Defense, you've got big in healthcare, information technology, NASA, things like that, and then energy is about that big, almost nothing.
Really?
So whereas technology's transformed almost everything else in this country, because for 25 years oil had been priced at $15 a barrel, $20 a barrel, it was hard for new technologies to come to fruition. So I just think the entrepreneurial spirit, the technical spirit of this country can be manifested, and that's where energy takes off. We're in the healthcare business, we're in the energy business. The industry of healthcare, spends about 7 or 8% on R&D every year. The energy industry spends about 1 to 2% on R&D every year. The difference between those two things is like $50 billion of annual R&D spending. I have no idea what the next president's going to do, but the one thing I would tell you is that clean energy is eminently doable, eminently solvable. This country can really, however you put the solution set, in other words, diversity, more security, reduce global warming. These are all eminently doable without economic catastrophe, because there's been no technology spent so far, fundamentally, and there's a lot of technical solutions to this problem. And I just think it's not, there's no such thing as perfect free markets. I think it's a market that needs a little catalyst, from the government to say, here's what we'd like to see done, and then I think the entrepreneurial dollars will flow to that.
Do you think that and what I'd like to do is ask for questions from the audience or comments in a minute. Do you think that the craziness over the last week is going to screw some of the stuff up? I mean, basically, over the weekend, you saw all of the financial things. You all have GE Capital, so you were exposed to this maybe a little bit, or maybe not. What's going to happen now? Are we going to get set back for years because of all the shenanigans that are going on in the financial crisis, or how's this going to play out?
Look, I think, Eric, people should be concerned, but not panicked. I think so far the Fed and Treasury have been doing the right things. GE Capital is a part of GE, but we earned $5.2 billion through the first half of the year. We do boring stuff, fundamentally in financial services. I'm proud of that. That's the best thing you can say. But clearly, people need to be concerned, and this needs to be worked through and resolved. Because I do think it's hard to have a springboard to do other things when everything intersects through financial services. And so I think this is smart for people to be working on this and to be concerned right now.
So basically making sure that the financial structures and the funding is capable, like governments and so forth, to actually make this happen. We're going to need that. We're going to need the debt markets to actually
Look, I think that's absolutely true, not just for energy, but for a broad array of different things.
Yeah. So could we get some comments? Mr. Vice President, perhaps would you like to make any comments on this, since I think you, in fact, inspired us to be here? Sorry to call on you cold.
Thank you. I hadn't planned to make any comments, but I'll be glad to. I just want to compliment Jeff for not only providing leadership within General Electric, but also having the political courage as a business leader to speak up in Washington, D.C., and to join with other business leaders, not as many as we should have, to advocate policies. And I think it's quite extraordinary that the renewable energy tax credit that gave rise to the wind energy in the U.S. and is now giving rise to concentrating solar thermal, which is very nearly cost competitive right now. A lot of plants under construction competitively. Photovoltaics will intersect with it over the next several years, as will geothermal. But that renewable tax credit is being considered right now in Washington, D.C. Over the last 20 years, it's been allowed to expire 17 times. So while the Congress is voting to open up offshore oil drilling, which will have zero impact on gasoline prices for at least 15 years. As everybody knows, it's just a Potemkin solution. And while they're leasing oil shale, which is a move that would be game over for the climate crisis, they're preparing to filibuster against the renewable energy tax credit. I can't imagine that.
Yeah.
And anyway, what could we do to change that, Jeff?
Look, I would say, again, I think today everybody gets clouded because, the headlines each morning. But, it is important for this country to have an energy policy. And that ought to be one of the first jobs of whoever the next president is. And like I said, Eric, I don't think this is hard. I actually think, again, I'd say healthcare is hard, right? Solving the U.S.'s healthcare system, this is actually quite difficult. Energy actually isn't hard. The technology exists, doesn't have to be invented, needs to be applied. There needs to be a price for carbon, things like that. These are all things that can really happen, and so that's just where we have to, to Vice President Gore's point, the production tax credit, which is one of the cornerstones to the renewable performance standards and to really driving renewable energy, gets approved every 2 years. And so there's immense, I would say, volatility around the supply chain, which makes the cost go up. And the only reason why it's every 2 years is people want to have their butt kissed or something. It's a real process.
That would be a political statement.
It'd be that's the most polite I would say that I would talk about it.
That's right.
Versus just saying, okay, we're going to approve it for a decade and then we're going to sunset it.
Yeah.
I'm not for expensive electricity. I'm for cheap electricity. But the way you would do these things, I think, is to put them in place for a period of time and then sunset it.
Do you have, it looks like Esther has a question? Yeah, okay.
Sure. Let me try and move the conversation, I hope, in the direction Eric was taking it already. You've been talking about two markets that are really imperfect right now. What is the role of individuals, presumably aided by better information on their personal consumption, their personal health habits? There's a lot of information floating around, but it's not really specific to individuals, so they play a very passive role. How could they be made more active in solving some of these problems?
Well, I think there's two different answers. I think with energy, it's all about, really working with utilities to make consumers very knowledgeable about their energy consumption and what they do. And I think that's all about, kind of the last mile in the home, making the appliances smart, and having real economic incentives for the utility and the consumer to do a great job on conservation. And I think that is only beginning. That's in its nascent phase. There's not enough data in the home for consumers to make the right decisions. And I would say the consumers don't have to do it proactively. It can be done passively. And that technology exists today. It's just a question of getting it financed and getting it in the home. So I think that's key on that one. Healthcare, again, is much more difficult. Healthcare, everybody talks about information technology as being the key to reforming healthcare. That is true. But I think we still have to recognize that it's basically a business process issue that depends on your insurance company, what city you live in, things like that. And that's why I say healthcare is going to be more difficult. But information technology, both in energy and healthcare, is one of the avenues to really driving cost down and quality up.
Have you taken a view on the rate at which you said earlier you have multiple bets in the various solutions? Have you all taken a position for a plan, a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan, of which ones you think will be number 1, number 2, number 3? Does it make sense, for example, for you all to announce that in some framework and to get everybody behind it? Because you have better understanding of the rate of technology improvement across these things than I think anybody else.
Look, we straddle a bunch of different, in other words, we're part of a group called U.S. Climate Action Partnership. We are in various industry consortiums. We hang out with Boone Pickens. We hang out with a bunch of different people. I would say our own view is renewables, big, huge, much bigger than we see today. Gas, because it's the cleanest, lowest cost alternative. And then I would say we're long in investing in power storage, where they call that batteries. So I would say those, if we had $3 to invest, those would be the first 3. And then, for us, just because we've been in it for a long time, we've put a fair amount of money into what I would call big bet baseload technology, clean coal, nuclear. Mainly because whether it happens in U.S. or not, those are going to be massive markets in China, India, all the other places where we do business. And so we've done, a lot to put investment in those technologies as well. But I'd say renewable, power storage, gas, big bet baseload, and conservation. Those would be the 5.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious as to where you see the intersection of the public and private sectors, especially in the United States, in this relationship. We've seen where legislation can bring this in terms of tax breaks at the individual level or at a corporate level, but how much investment are we looking for from the private sector in terms of involvement from the government and from the public sector, and what does that look like in 15 or 20 years?
Look, I think the private sector gets the job done. I think the public sector is a catalyst, plays the role that it always plays, which is, here's what we'd like to see happen. We'd like to see more renewables. We'd like to see, and we're willing to put tax incentives or strict funding or things like that. But ultimately, this is going to be solved by the private sector. Now, look, the private sector has spent almost nothing on energy so far. If you look at the dollars that have gone into energy over the last decade of the venture capital decade, it's been almost nothing. So I think there's lots of opportunities. But, I would say this in some, with humility, right? As I sit here today, look, I'm a lifelong Republican. I believe in free markets. But I think to a certain extent we worship false idols over time. There's been no such thing in all the businesses we do that the government hasn't played some role as a catalyst. So let's just be clear about that. The government does have a role to play in energy, in healthcare, as a catalyst for change, and should. So I think sometimes we think the free market is whatever the price of oil is today. That's not the free market. So I think we've got to be more facile about how we think about the public's role, because in the end, clean energy is both a technology and it's a public policy, both.
Well, in fact, there is an opportunity right now to be even more involved, because the government's going to do all sorts of stimulus packages. So why don't they send some of that money in something that's really socially responsible, renewable energy, for example, right? Because the products are there, the investments are there, and the payback compounds enormously. Okay. Jim.
Hi. Could you tell us what you believe the role media will play in sustainability, and also what the role media will play with GE in the future, but specifically NBC Universal?
Look, we like the media business, so it's an easy one to answer that we're in the content business. I think it fits well with GE in total. I think from a sustainability standpoint, it's probably around the edges from a standpoint of information, of how we run our own businesses, of we've had green weeks and things like that around the media space. So I don't think it's going to be massive in media, but look, we like the content business and are committed to to staying with it.
So our joint friend Scott McNeely taught me that whenever you have a meeting like this, you should always turn it into a sales call. So when does the turbine come? How much does it cost? So tell me, how much do these turbines cost? Right?
Let me put it this way. I think I'll make sure you get your wind turbine.
I want the biggest one.
You're going to pay full price, if you don't mind, because I'm going to have to move you up in front of other people, but we'll make sure it gets taken care
Well,
of.
like, how much do these things cost?
It's it's probably a couple $1 million, something like that.
A couple $1 million?
Yeah, something like
You're
that.
kidding.
Yeah. Well, they're great. Reliability is good. They're the best in the industry, and you can get them. Yeah.
Like, doesn't everyone here
I
want
mean, the
one?
last time I checked, Google wasn't exactly cheap. You guys aren't
No, seriously.
hurting for money, so it's
I mean,
but it's
how
good value.
many do you make?
No, look, the wind business for us, right? So in 2003, we basically spent $300 million to buy Enron's wind business out of bankruptcy.
Smart.
And that business this year will probably be somewhere between $7 and $8 billion in revenue.
Wow.
So I've done some bad deals in my day. This isn't one of them, And I would say that, again, in those days, I was, every new technology, we don't do it because we've got some kind of emotional connection. We only do it because we believe that it can be low cost, high quality. And so we were very skeptical about the wind business when we first got into it, and we finally acquired it just because we thought, at that level, who could go wrong?
I think you're being polite. I think it took a lot of courage at the time. I remember when gas was so cheap, nobody wanted these businesses.
Yeah.
It took a lot of courage.
No, so look, I think it's, we say green is green inside GE, and that's been, I think, a winning mantra. But there's nothing wrong with, I'd say as a 125, 130-year-old company, there's nothing wrong with making money, solving big societal problems, and we do that as well.
I think what I really want to do is salute you for not just running an extraordinarily impressive company, but taking the kind of risks that I would hope all CEOs take to really not only build a great business, but really have an impact on all of us. And you did it first. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.